would like to invite Jocelynne Scutt to speak. Over to you, Jocelynne.
I'd actually like to begin at the end by referring to the words of Ruth Bader Ginsburg when she was appointed, when she took her place on the Supreme Court of the United States. And what she said was this: I would not be in this room today without the determined efforts of women and men who kept dreams of equal citizenship alive in days when few would listen. People like Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Harriet Tubman come to mind. I stand on the shoulders of those brave people. We in Australia could recite names too. Truganini, much more recently, Paula Gibbs. Also, we have, of course, Vida Goldstein, Mary Lee, Catherine Susanna Pritchard. We could go on. And every single one of us in this room today, every single one of us in this world today, stand on the shoulders of the brave women who went before. And one of the aspects of the women's movement of the 1970s, which was not the second wave, there's never been waves of the women's movement, because women have agitated, women have campaigned, women have women's rights consistently through the ages. And this narrative of wave is simply wrong. It's as if there's a wave and then there's a recession. There's never a recession of what we do or what women have done or how women fight and how women struggle. So we need to get rid of that language, and I'll come to language. But we need to remember our history, and that Australia was the first country in the world to give for women to win the right to vote. Now, sadly, it did not extend to Indigenous Australian women, and we stand properly reviled for that. But we won that right. Finland actually claims it because Australia is simply written off the map, and our activity, our actions, our campaign needs to be recognised, our campaigning skills. This is on the screen is the banner that women from this country sent to the United Kingdom to say, we've won the vote here, we've won the vote. You too can win the vote in the United Kingdom, and all will be well, or even better best. Vida Goldstein stood up for the rights of women. She was the first woman in what was the British Empire to stand for Parliament. She stood to the Senate in 1903 when women could first stand federally. In South Australia, of course, they won it in 1894. But Vida Goldstein, the statement on the screen could be read in ways that could be derided, because she talks about moral values, she talks about a world crusade, she talks about spiritual humanity. And these words, of course, have been appropriated in different ways to misrepresent what Vida Goldstein meant. Vida Goldstein meant we have an ethical position, and it's an ethical position, a moral position for which we fight and we campaign. That is our crusade. Susan B. Anthony said, failure is impossible. And when I first came into the women's movement, all of us believed that failure was impossible. We believed we would actually change the world. We fortunately had historians amongst us who seem to be absent at the present time from the present engagement in terms of women's campaigning. And we therefore knew that we were not the first. We were the first in the sense of the many, many, many who had come before us, one of them, Susan B. Anthony, the United States suffragist. Robin Morgan coined the term, the phrase, the personal is political. And we, in the 20th century, and we too have recognised in turn that the political is personal. Women like Lee Rhiannon recognised that we were not the first, that we were standing on the shoulders of the women who'd gone before us. Her mother, Freda Brown, had been active in the women's movement long before Lee was even born, and Lee Rhiannon continued her activism. We had 6 demands, and let me come to the words of Joyce Stevens, that wonderful, strong Australian feminist. Why are we women's liberationists? Because women's work is never done and is underpaid or boring or repetitious, and we're the first to get the sack, and what we look like is more important than what we do. And if we are raped, it's our own fault. And if we are bashed, we must have provoked it. And if we raise our voices, we're nagging bitches. And if we enjoy sex, we're nymphomaniacs. And if we don't, we're frigid. And if we love women, it's because we can't get a real man. And if we ask our doctors too many questions, it's because we're neurotic and or pushy. And if we expect community care for our children, we're selfish. And if we stand up for our rights, we're aggressive and unfeminine. And if we don't, we're typical weak females. And if we want to get married, we're out to trap a man. And if we don't, we're unnatural. And because we still can't get an adequate, safe contraceptive, but men can walk on the moon. And if we can't cope or don't want a pregnancy, we're made to feel guilty about it. And for lots and lots of other reasons, we are part of the women's liberation movement. I pay tribute to the wonderful Joyce Stevens for that, which appears now on, well, we hope it's still appearing now on posters, the women's liberation movement. We fought for equal pay, standing on the shoulders of women before. My book, Wage Rage, will point this out. From at least the end of the 19th century, my book goes back to the end of the 19th century and right up to now. My mind, my body, my choice, and my right to engage in education in order to advance my own rights, my personal rights for which we have to stand up, and the rights of all other women. The issues for which we fought are still on the table. Take, for example, rape and sexual offences law. In 1977, the Women's Electoral Lobby drafted the Rape and Other Sexual Offences Bill. In that bill, drafted by myself, Di Graham, a wonderful campaigner. We began campaigning when she was 60 and I was 28. And Kerry Hubel, who another wonderful campaigner, the first executive officer of the Women's Advisory Council, established by Neville Wran, the Premier at the time of New South Wales, a wonderful contributor to the rights of women. And in this draft bill, the Well Draft Bill, one of the provisions was, this is 1977, that judges must be educated and the barristers who work in the field. And this, it's not enough to an implication, it must be in the law. Well, it's taken 40 years. Last year, Canada put very provision into their own sexual offences law. When I actually put this proposition at a seminar in the Wentworth Hotel in Sydney, I was accompanied on the stage by a number of people, one of whom a woman, I shan't name her, but I could, who actually rebounded against what I'd said and said that this was wrong to say that judges should be educated. I believe she actually hopefully has changed her position. Women's rights, women's refuge, the fact that women had to leave their own homes with their children and be homeless, and the women who set up Elsie Women's Refuge in 1973, we pay tribute to them because they did change the world. Even homes, violence in the family, that was a real issue for us in the 1970s and the 1980s. Another issue which we addressed and where we were vilified and continue to be so was in relation to the sexual violence against women, which is embodied in the exploitation of women through the pornography industry. And that was a huge issue. And in that, we were actually replicating, in a sense, the work of those women at the end of the 19th century who fought to have the right women to engage in sexual activity fully and freely, not under any control. They recognized that prostituted women were exploited women, and they were vilified, just as we are vilified today when we say that we want women's rights to have proper jobs, proper incomes, and not to be reliant on being exploited by men through the industry, the prostitution, the exploitation of women, or the pornography industry. There were many recognitions amongst feminists that there were different positions: socialist feminists, radical feminists, revolutionary feminists, and there were the women who continued the aim of peace. We wanted peace. These are the women at Pine Gap in South Australia, demonstrating against the United States invasion of Australia through these so-called defence facilities, where they actually think they own our land. And when the Whitlam government attempted to discover what was going on at Pine Gap, they got into trouble. We also recognise the way that women became engaged with the women's movement. In 1978, there was a fantastic, wonderful conference at Macquarie University. The principal organisers, Sabina Erica and Suzanne Bellamy. Suzanne Bellamy, that wonderful artist, and Sabina Erica, the wonderful writer. We had the most fantastic conferences and seminars. We also, of course, had ovulars. Women recognised that a seminar is not really what women do. When we engage in discussion and debate with each other, we are engaging in ovular activity. We were speaking out. We spoke about language. We spoke about the fact that words matter. My book, Singular Women, Reclaiming Sisterhood, was saying spinsters were powerful, wonderful women. They were engaged in the spinning industry, and they demonstrated time and time again when men had their wives up for sale at markets, and they would descend on the sale and the market. Women's voices must be heard, and the silences must be broken. This means that not only women have a right to speak, but we have a right to be listened to, and we must be. The issue about silencing is twofold. We can be silenced because we don't speak, and there's never been a time when women do not speak. But we can also be silenced because we are not listened to, we are not heard. We all know the experience around the conference table when we say something or a woman says something extraordinarily intelligent and a real contribution to the discussion. And then everybody ignores it until a man repeats precisely the same thing and is lauded for it. In these circumstances, we must always come back to what the other woman said and say, as Julie Smith said, as Rhonda Jones said, as Pearl Gibbs said, we need to affirm that what women say matters and must be acknowledged. But feminism does not mean that everything is okay. Principles are important and central to what we as women have a right to demand of ourselves as well as of the world. It's not wrong for us to say that we do demand that women adhere to a feminist ethic. We are still agitating here in the 2000s, and of course it's interesting to be seen as the old women of the movement. We need to engage with women, law and culture, conformity, contradiction and conflict, recognising that every single culture, it doesn't matter what it is infused with patriarchy, has come from patriarchy. They took over from what women have established, and that is what they are doing now. They are doing it through the notion that we should go into a doctor's surgery, we should go into so-called cosmetic surgeons, we should go into so-called aesthetic surgeons and have our bodies chopped about. There is no part of a woman's body now that is safe from the surgeon's knife. We can talk about female genital mutilation, but it's going on within our own Western culture in terms of women having their genitals actually so-called consenting to be changed in some way to make them look more respectable or aesthetic. One really wonders what the motivation is behind this. Of course, it's money, and it's the suppression and oppression of women. In 2022, we held a women's parliament, again on the shoulders of the women of the past, who in this country ran women's parliaments to gain the vote. At this women's parliament, we had a motion to say that CEDAW, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, signed by this country, the United Kingdom, in 1981, ratified by this country, the United Kingdom, in 1986, after Australia, of course, has never domesticated that convention, and we are demanding a Women's Bill of Rights. Protest to be effective must be followed by resolute action. And this is what we are engaged in and what we engage in still. We have not given up. And I conclude on these words of Adrian Rich. If I could have one wish for my own sons, it is that they should have the courage of women. I mean by this something very concrete and precise. The courage I have seen in women who, in their private and public lives, both in the interior world of their dreaming, thinking and creating, and the outer world of patriarchy, are taking greater and greater risks, both psychic and physical, in the evolution of a new vision. Victory is conceivable. Courage has its own momentum. In the words of Millicent Garrett Fawcett, courage calls to courage everywhere, and its voice cannot be denied. Our voice will not be denied.